Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar, Table Calculations, a First Foray. This webinar is part of our customer webinar series, Talk Data to Me, which is aimed to provide tips, tricks, and how-tos to make you a smarter Tableau customer. My name is Megan Fay, and I'm part of the marketing team here at Tableau, and I'll be your moderator today. Just a few quick items before we get started. All lines are currently muted. If you have a question, please use the Q&A window and select Send to All Panelists. We'll answer questions at the end if time allows. The recording of this webinar and a copy of the slide deck will be sent out about a day after the webinar. With that, I'd like to introduce our presenter today, Tristan Mickelite. Tristan is a senior product consultant here at Tableau and will be giving you an intro to table calculations. He'll cover the basics, how they are calculated, and scenarios when they can be used. Tristan, take it away.
Thanks, Megan. So as Megan said, my name is Tristan Mickelite. I'm a senior product consultant here at Tableau. And what you guys have seen is we're going to be going over an introduction to table calculations today. So if this is the very first time you've seen table calculations, we'll show just a couple scenarios where they're used. And then we'll go through exactly how you can go through the compute using options. You'll see that table calculations are a unique type of calculation within Tableau because they're completely dynamic and based on the view that you use them on. You'll see this as we go through, but they're going to have some flexibility based on how they'll be calculated. So we'll start with quick table calcs, which are table calculations that are built into any measure that you use within Tableau. And then at the end of the session, we'll actually go through and write some of our own table calculations from scratch. So with that, we're going to pop over to Tableau Desktop. We'll be using the sample data set that ships with the Tableau products. So if we go over here, we'll be using that Superstore data set. I'm just going to be connecting to one of my saved data sources. If this is the first time that you've seen Tableau, this is a little bit more advanced of a topic than just the general dragging and dropping. I'm going to gloss over some of that to really focus on these table calculations, but you should be able to follow along as well. And as Megan said, we will send out a recording of this as well as the workbook that we put together. If we're going to try and save some time at the end for some Q&A, but certainly use that chat function of WebEx. We'll be checking that as we go throughout. If I start to see chat questions come in that are pertinent to the topic we're talking about and something that's useful for the whole group, I'll address it throughout the presentation. If not, at the very end, we'll try and address as many questions as we can in that Q&A session. So very first thing, let's look at a scenario that you would use a table calculation in and start with one of those quick table calculations. So I'm going to build out a view where I'm going to break down my sales numbers by my regions and my product subcategories. So I'm going to grab in sales, drag it to the column shelf, drag region to rows, and then we're going to break that out even further with our product subcategories. I'm going to just do a one-click sort at the top of the screen here, just to make it a little easier to see what we're looking at. And so when we have a view like this, one of the questions we might have to further our analysis for what we're looking at is how much percent of our sales each of these subcategories is taking up. So I might want to actually label those bars by the percent of total that they are accounting for. I'm going to hold my control key, grab my sales pill off of the column shelf, and drag that over to the label shelf of the marks card. When I do that, we're now telling Tableau that we want to label all of these bars by those direct sales values that we're working with. Now, the next step to get to that percent of total is this is where we can leverage that quick table calculation that I mentioned at the beginning. Again, quick table calculations are built into every measure you use in Tableau. So whether a measure is sitting up on the column shelf or it's sitting on one of your shelves on the marks card on the left-hand side here, you're going to have availability to use these quick table calculations. So when I drop down on this sum of sales pill that's sitting on our label shelf, near the bottom here is where you're going to see those options for those quick table calcs. These are some of the most common types of analysis people would want to pivot their measures into. You'll see some examples such as running total, doing a percent difference. That year-over-year growth is an extremely common one. For this case, I'm going to move over and choose that percent of total. What you'll see now is on the right-hand side of every bar, instead of labeling by those direct sales values, we're now labeling by that percent of total value. And another thing to note is on the right-hand side of my sum of sales pill that's on the label shelf is this triangle. Anytime you use a table calculation within Tableau, whether it's one of those quick table calculations or if a table calculation that you write from scratch, it's going to be designated with this triangle on the right-hand side. So just a quick way to be able to know that these table calcs are in play. So what we're looking at on this view now is when we look at this specific bar for phones. Phones from the central region are making up 3% of our total sales for our entire company across all of time. You can quickly look through each of the bars going down here and seeing that percent of total across all of our sales. Now, the next steps that we could do with table calcs, what I mentioned at the very beginning, is that they're extremely flexible and dynamic. So if I was to come in, for instance, and exclude my East region, if we just remember that this bar at the very top was sitting at 3% of our total sales, once I exclude the East from our sales, notice that that bar jumped up to 5.2%. So table calculations are the very last thing computed within Tableau. If you're doing any filters, those are going to be computed before your table calc, and then that table calc will run only based on what's on your current view. So as people are interacting with views, they're filtering out fields, maybe adding new fields in, your table calculations are going to automatically update to reflect those percent of totals or whatever type of calculation that is based on the data that's present there. So that's part of that dynamic nature that I was speaking to, and the fact that they're completely based on the view that you're using. Also, what we'll see in a second here is if we drop down on any field that's a table, the really important part is this compute using option. We'll be going through this in more depth in a couple slides here, and we'll actually come back to this view to show what types of options are available with this compute using. But just wanted to point out that anytime you're using a table calc, that's going to be an option that is available to you. So let's move over, look at a couple different scenarios of those quick table calcs where you would use those, and then we'll come back to look at that compute using. And later near the end, we'll really show some of the use cases where that compute using is going to become important. So I'm just going to label this my percent of total. This is a sheet we will come back to. Let's just go over to a brand new worksheet and look at another scenario where you would use a quick table calculation. So I'm going to drag my sales pill back out to the row shelf. We now have that total sales bar for all of our data set. And I'm going to break this down by my order date. So right now we have a line chart looking at our sales broken out by year. On the marks card on the left-hand side here, I'm going to change this from automatic to be a bar chart. So now we can just see those direct sales that are happening within each year. A really common type of analysis that people like to do is year-over-year growth, or seeing between each of these years what that percentage change in our sales was. So we can see that 2012, our sales dropped off from 2011. And then we had pretty significant increases in sales as we moved into 2013 and 2014. And what we want to do is actually see some bars that directly tell us how much between each of these years sales either increased or decreased. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to actually drag out a second instance of sales onto the row shelf. We now have two bars. Right now they're showing the exact same thing, those sales broken out by year. And on this second sum of sales pill, I'm going to drop down, go back to that quick table calculation, and now we're going to do that percent difference. We could also choose that year-over-year growth. In this scenario, that percent difference in the year-over-year growth is the exact same thing. So let's actually select that here. What we can see now is that when we mentioned that in 2012 our sales decreased, on this bar that we have down here, we have that direct percentage that it decreased by. So when we're comparing our 2011 to our 2012 sales, we can quickly see with that one-click quick table calculation that we've dropped almost 3% of our sales. Going from 2012 to 2013, we increased our sales by almost 30%. What we could do as well here to be able to really highlight and show how that decrease or increase happened within each of our years is I'm going to hold control on this table calculation, looking at that percent difference. And I'm going to drag that over to the color shelf. Now we can quickly see with this that color on these bars that we did drop within 2012. Looks like our biggest increase was in 2013, which isn't readily apparent when you're just comparing the two bars at the top part of the screen here. But now using that quick table calc and using that quick table calc on the color shelf specifically, it's really easy to see which year we really increased our sales by the biggest factor. So again, notice that we have that triangle on the right-hand side of our second sales pill here. Just being able to quickly track that that is our table calculation, and we will have options to look at that compute using as well. Also notice when you're using one of these percent differences or these year-over-year growths, you will have an option for a relative to. Right now, we're checking that percent difference just from the previous year always. We could do it from the year that's following the one we're currently looking at, checking that percent difference from the very first year that occurs on our view or that last, or actually choosing one of those specific years that we want to rate everything comparatively to. So just wanted to show another one of those quick table calculations you would use and really drive home the fact that when you're using these quick table calcs, they're pretty flexible, as well as being able to use anywhere on this marks card as well as that column and row shelf. So we're going to label this our percent difference, or let's just say that's our year-over-year growth. Let's move on and look at one more quick table calculation, and then we'll take a step back and really examine what's happening with those compute using options. So the next table calculation that we want to do is, again, let's look at those different sales numbers that we have. And this time, I'm going to break it out by a finer level of detail on our date field. So I'm actually going to right-click our order date, drag it to the column shelf. If you do a right-click drag within Tableau, instead of automatically choosing a level of a hierarchy or choosing an aggregation to use, it's going to give you some options to choose that before it places it on the view. So with that right-click drag when we're using our date field, Tableau is going to give us the options to either choose all of our dates that are present within this data set, our different discrete date parts. So if I were to choose month in the top half of this pane, we'd be bucketing all of our sales values into the months of the year, January through December, regardless of the actual year that they occurred within. So sales from January 2011 will get added together with sales from January 2012, and then we'll just have those monthly buckets. What I'm actually going to do for this case, though, is I'm going to go down to the continuous month date part at the bottom here. What this will do is break out all of our sales values by those months, but also keeping with it the years that they occurred within. So to show that, we'll see at the bottom axis of our screen, we start at November 2010. We have all of those months of the years associated with the actual year that they occurred in. So we're seeing our full timeline of sales at the monthly level. I'm just going to quickly use the Show Me card here. If you haven't used Show Me before, this is a way that you can pivot into a new type of visualization. Tableau will look at the types of fields you have on your screen, so it notices that we have one measure and a date field, and then it's going to highlight the different types of charts that will work for this visualization. We can choose any of the ones that are highlighted right now to quickly pivot in. We can see that if we wanted to use that tree map and such, but I'm just going to go down and use that filled map or that filled area chart on the bottom here. Let's close out that Show Me card. And so right now we're seeing all of our sales values for the individual months. If I was to hover over these points, we'll see the month and the year that that sales value occurred within. But maybe I want to see that running total of my sales and how our sales have added together over time to see our total lifetime sales at the very end of the chart. That, again, is just one of those quick table calculations. So when I drop down on that sum of sales pill, go down that quick table calculation, choose that running total. Now every month of the year is getting added on to the previous month of the year, and at the very end, we'll see that total sales number for our data set. Again, notice that we have that triangle designating that we are using a table calculation. And if we were to do any filtering on this view, that table calculation will compute itself afterwards, and we'll still get that final running total after all filters have been applied. So this will be our running total sheet. So now let's take that step back and really examine what's happening with compute using. So the power of table calculations comes from the fact that they're calculated dynamically on a view at the very last thing within the order of operations. But really, that compute using is what's going to give us the majority of our flexibility for how to use these table calcs. So let's take a moment to look at what that compute using means. And I'm going to show you a handy way that as you're starting to dive into table calcs and to start to use them within your own analysis, that you can do some testing and really be sure that your calculations are computing the way that you want them to be. So I'm just going to bring a couple dimensions on the view that are going to break out into just a couple different rows and columns to be able to display an example of this compute using. So I'm going to start with region, drag that to the row shelf. I'm going to drag order date out to columns. So now we're going to be able to break our values down by both our regions and those order dates. And next thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to bring in number of records onto the text shelf. Again, I did a right-click drag, so Tableau is going to give us the option to choose the aggregation before it's placed on the view. And what I'm going to choose here is our minimum number of records. So number of records is essentially just a calculated field that places a 1 on every row of your data set. It's a way that you can count up how many items occur within each dimension. But since it's only a 1 on every row, if we were to choose minimum or maximum number of records, we're going to get a 1 in every area of this table because that minimum value here is always going to be a 1 for that number of records. Now, what I'm going to do on this is I'm going to go down, use a quick table calculation for a running total. What this is going to do is tell Tableau that we want to sum up those ones. So if we look at this individual row right now, just looking at the central region, since each one of these cells of the table within the central region all contained ones, that running total is going to add 1 on each time we move over. Notice when we move down to the east, south, west, that running total is going to restart itself. So this would be my advice as you guys are starting to learn how to use a compute using. Set up a view with a couple dimensions like this, use that minimum number of records, switch it into a running total, and then play around with those compute using options and really see how that count is running and where that count is going to restart itself. So right now we're using table across, which means that that running total is going to add up across each row. In this case, each individual region makes up a row. And when you move to a new row, that count is going to restart itself back at 1. If I were to choose to compute using table down, now we're looking at each individual order date, each of those individual columns. We're going to sum up the ones going down the column. When we move over to a new date or a new column, that count is going to restart itself. A couple of the other options here, if we were to do across then down, that count doesn't actually ever restart itself, but it'll move across the row. So we'll move across the central region, pop down to the east region, and continue that count all the way till the very end of the table where we get our total number of adding all of our ones up to 16. In the same manner, looking at the compute using down then across, same exact concept, but now we're going to be moving down each column, moving over to a second column, and continuing that count. Again, the very bottom right-hand corner is where we'll reach that 16. Also, if we were to choose cell, that's just on the cell level. So each of those compute usings will restart every time you hit a new cell. And really the unique area of compute using is going to be based on the dimensions that are on your view. So no matter what you have on the view, all of your dimensions are going to be a possibility to choose to compute on. And what you can think when you choose a specific dimension is you're going to be running that calculation across that dimension, and any other dimension on the view is going to be considered a restart. So for instance, when I choose that I want to compute using my order date, we'll be running across all of our order dates. So we're really looking at our date field. We're adding those up as we move across all of our date fields. And since we have not selected to compute using on region, notice that region is unselected. Every time we move to a new region, it's a restart of that calculation. So again, to reiterate, if you choose a specific dimension to compute using on, you're going to be running across that dimension with your calculation, or the running total count in this case. And when you hit a new element of any of the other dimensions on the view, it's going to restart. So same thing with region. Once I select region, within each year, we're going to be counting up those 1s to 4. When we move over to a new member of the year field, it's going to restart that count. Now, one last thing to add in here, just to show a couple more of the options that will come into play that we'll actually use in our analysis in a second here. If I was to bring out category to my view, so now I have my regions broken down by each of my product categories as well. If we go back to compute using, notice that a couple extra options have come into the view here, specifically all of these pane options. Tableau will consider a pane to be whatever is the higher level dimension on your view. Since we have each of our regions are now broken out by our furniture or our categories, Each of these categories is considered a pane on your view. So we have 3 panes right now, which you can almost consider their individual tables when we're using these compute using options. So if I were to choose to say pane down, that's going to be restarting our count almost like this is its own table. When we move into a new pane, all of those calculations are going to restart themselves. We're going to name this our compute using page. And so even in my own analysis, when I'm starting to get into some more complicated table calculations, maybe I have a visualization that's fairly complicated with a lot of dimensions on it, and I'm trying to figure out exactly that compute using I need for my table calc, I will come over to a view like this, bring in my minimum number of records, figure out exactly how I want that calculation to run by looking at how these additions are taking place, and then I'll take that compute using back to my visualization and apply it. So this is just a really easy way to visualize exactly how your calculations are going to be computed. So now with a little bit of that compute using knowledge under our belt, looking back at the use case where we're looking at that percent of total, right now these percent of totals are for our entire data set going across all of our values here. And so if we look at that compute using, we'll see that we're compute using on table down. So those percentages, it's running down the entire table, taking into account every bar, and then finding that percent of total. What we could do if we wanted to say, for instance, see the percent of totals that each of our subcategories are taking account for within each specific region. Since regions are making up panes on this view, when I choose pane down, now we can highlight the single region and see that chairs are taking up 17% of my total sales from my central region. When we move into the south region, these percent of total, or these percentages that are labeling the bars, are unique only to the south region. We're not comparing to any of the other regions. When we see 11.5%, that means that chairs take up 11.5% of sales only within our south region. So that's where those compute using options are really going to come into play with that flexibility, is being able to tell Tableau exactly where the area of focus are that you want these table calculations to be ran. So we are coming up a little bit close to the time here. I'm just going to show a quick example of where the written table calculations come into play. So far, everything we've been doing is through those quick table calculations or those drop downs on the measures shelf. But let's go in and just take a quick example of how we could write our own table calculation. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to bring in my sum of my sales. I'm going to break this out by both my categories and drill down through that hierarchy. So we're breaking those down by my subcategories as well. And I'm actually going to use from version 9, now our reference lines are just drag and drop into the view. I'm going to bring in 2 reference lines. So one reference line that is the average value of our sales going across the entire table. And a second reference line that's the average sales within each individual pane. Again, when we're working with panes, we're going to be working with each of our different categories will make up a pane on the view. And you might already kind of see where we're going here, is that those options, what I did with that reference line, the difference between that table and the pane, I'm going to show how we can write a table calculation, use that compute using for table across and also pane across to be able to tell Tableau what each of these average values are and compare if our sales values, these individual bars, are above or below our average lines. So I'm going to right click on the left-hand side of the view here, create a calculated field. This calculation is just going to be our sales KPI. What we're going to do here is within the right-hand side where you see all of our functions listed out, if I drop down on our different categories, you'll notice that table calculations are a category. Every table calculation that's usable within Tableau will be listed in this category here. Even those quick table calculations we are working with, you could write those from scratch. And what I'm going to choose here is we have these different window functions, specifically window average. So with this, we're going to be able to have that compute using option, tell Tableau what that window is that we want to find an average within. And we just need to tell it, if we look at the syntax, what we want to find an average of. Since we're breaking out our view by sum of sales, we want to look at the window average of those sum of sales. And now the very last part of this calculation is we want to compare each individual bar and if it's above or below those average values. So with my calculation, I'm going to write, we're checking if that window average of the sum of sales is greater than just those individual sum of sales. So the right-hand side of this calculation, the sum of sales portion, is looking at each of these bars individually. The left-hand side, this window average, that's where we're going to tell Tableau, based on how we compute using, which average line we want to compare this to. Once I select OK, this is going to become a true-false calculation. There's two options. Either that sum of sales bar is greater than the average, or that sum of sales bar is below or less than that average, and we'll get a false value. So when I select OK, notice on the left-hand side of the screen here, we have that sales KPI, and then we have that true-false notifier next to it, telling us that that is just a Boolean calculation. I'm going to drag that out to the color shelf. Very first thing we can see here is that our true values, which is actually where they're below the average, let's actually just switch the syntax there. We're going to look for where our cells are greater than the average to make this stand out a little better. So true bars right now, those are values that are greater than our average line. Notice that we are actually calculating off this average line that goes across the entire table, which we can double check with that compute using. We are doing table across. So within that calculation, any one of our sales bars that's above this entire average line for the table will be colored orange or have that true value. Now with that flexibility of the table calcs, I can drop down on compute using and choose pane across. Now what we're doing, if we drag off that reference line going across the entire table, is when we choose pane across, we're checking each of those sales values within its individual pane or within that individual category, and then coloring them if they're above those reference lines. So just an example there where you can show that compute using is going to be an important factor. That's going to give you a lot of flexibility for a single calculation to change what you actually care about on this view. It's a single click to be able to decide we want to see all the bars above our total average sales, or we just want to see if they're above that average sales within their own categories. So we do only have a couple minutes here. I didn't have any chat messages or questions come in through my chat, but Megan, do you have any that have come in through yours?
Yeah, thanks, Tristan. We have a couple questions and a couple minutes to answer them. The first question comes from Brent, and he is asking, is there a way to show percentages for measures as only one color instead of multiple?
So when we go back, let's see where we actually built that in, this year-over-year growth. It sounds like it might need some clarification from Brent, but when you're looking at this, he's asking if those percentages could be shown as a single color. So instead of looking at green and red, that might be, just clarify if I'm wrong, Brent, to be able to choose that color palette where instead of going green to red, we could actually drop down and say that we want to use that single blue color to see where it's the greatest change or the least amount of change.
To add on to that question, he said a lot of the times he'll get a white and black colors to show, and he just wants one color. So I think this may have answered that question for him.
Okay.
Another question from Brent is on stacked bar charts. He noticed that a lot of his dashboards will not show certain labels because of sizing issues. Do you have any suggestions?
So could you repeat that one more time? So some of the sizing issues are causing labels not to show, and that was on stacked bar charts?
Correct.
That will be somewhat dependent on your view. Some of the options that you could choose if you do, this is going to be a messy use case to show, but if we were to say breaking this out by, let's say, what's something that's just a couple fields, our segment where we have a lot of these labels packed in, it might be hard just to determine by looking at this. It's a little busy and hard to see, like some of these cases, they're not showing those labels. It is crowded. It's a little overwhelming for your end user if you have this many labels. So my advice there would be to leverage the tooltips as well as within the label options. You can choose things such as only showing labels for things that are selected or highlighted, for instance. So when I choose that selected option, only when my user clicks on something will they see a label. And especially if you're going to have a lot of items, highlighted might be a better one, where when you choose chairs or tables and are comparing them across, then you'll have those options to show them. So my advice with that would be is sometimes messing with the formatting to get the label to show, but also trying not to overwhelm your end user with too many labels all at once, and building in some of these interactive paths for them to still get that information and be able to focus in just on the things that matter to them.
Great. That's really helpful. All right. That's all we have time for today. Thank you, Tristan. That was a great presentation. Everyone look for an email from us with a recording of the webinar and the workbook Tristan used. Thanks for joining today, and we hope you can apply what you learned today in your day-to-day work. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.